First of all, what is your assessment on the current state of U.S.-China relationship?
I always say it's difficult to compress this relationship with one or two words. It has always been complex. There are many areas in which we have great cooperation, such as we've seen recently on the Iran nuclear agreement, where the United States worked with China to get that agreement along with Russia and the European nations. We also have seen important agreement recently on climate change, with China and the United States coming into alignment on the need to do something about it. And I also have to say that even though there are occasional disagreements with respect to trade, the trading relationship between our two countries has been significant and enormously beneficial to both countries over the last 40-odd years of my experience. Yet there are issues with China that cause difficulties, such as the concerns we have about cybersecurity. We need greater understanding and transparency of what's going on in the sea. Claims on islands and building up of coral reefs and building up of islands right out of the bottom of the ocean. And what are they being used for? And why such large landing strips? So these kinds of issues cause us difficulty. So as with any country of that size and that importance, there will always be some difficulties. But I think on balance, the relationship has been sound. It has been solid for many, many years. And the evidence is the progress that China has made over the last 44 years since my first visit to China. The progress that China has made and the fact that China is playing a more important role on the world stage. This causes some tension because people are worried about the new role that China wishes to play. But I think that is manageable because China has interests that can be met by the world, and the world has interests that can be met by China. And the degree of trade that goes back and forth, not only with China and the West, China and Taiwan, I mean, there's an incredible amount of trade that goes back and forth. So I think it is a complex relationship, but one that has been managed rather well for the last 40-something years.
What are your expectations for President Xi Jinping's upcoming state visit? What can a state visit like this achieve from your vantage point?
I've been to a lot of state visits in the course of my time as chairman, as national security advisor, and as secretary of state. And sometimes it's so important just to have the style look proper, where both sides show respect to each other, and protocol is followed to the finest point, so that everybody is satisfied with the visit. But there can also be great substance comes from the visit. I'm quite sure that President Obama and President Xi will talk about the issue of cybersecurity. I think the issue of human rights will come up. And I think the issues associated with what's happening in the sea will come up, and how do we resolve the conflicts that exist in the area between China and its neighbors over territorial claims. The United States has offered to help, but the countries in the region, especially China, prefer to handle it as bilateral issues with the various countries in the region. So I think those are going to be the principal issues. I think they will also talk about the Syrian problem. I think they will talk about how both countries can work together to see if solutions cannot be found to that conflict. I think the president will also express concern about what's happening in North Korea once again, with the young leader shaking the uranium in the pot, if I can use that kind of colloquial expression. But every time he wants to get attention to himself, he does something like pretend he's going to shoot a rocket, or he starts up a reactor. And I'm sure that'll be a subject of discussion. We have always felt that perhaps our Chinese friends could do more to constraining his ambitions and his adventuresome activities. And I hope that will be the discussion. Recently, it seems like China has taken a slightly more objective approach to North Korea, and perhaps they will do a better job of encouraging the young leader to seek a new path to the future.
I understand. You were very involved in the six-party talks back in the 2000s. And I understand. But back to the U.S.-China relationship, do you think that, as President Xi does, that the U.S. and China can somehow create a new pattern of power politics that avoids the inevitable rivalry between a rising power and the already dominant one that we saw over and over again in history?
I think so, and I wouldn't even like to characterize it as power politics. What it is that we have two nations that have interest in the Pacific region, in the Western Pacific, and in Asia generally. And the United States, for many, many years, decades, had been the dominant military power in that region and the dominant political power. And now China has risen, and China is the second largest economy in the world. China has interest in that part of the world, and because of its economic strength, its new political ascendancy, it wishes to play a more dominant role. But we can't have dominance. Two people can't be dominant at the same time. So I think we'll have to find a way to work with each other, exchange views on the things that trouble us, ask China to tell us more with respect to transparency on their military activities and the issue of the islands. But I think it is quite possible for our two nations and the other nations in the region. We can't ignore Japan and Australia, New Zealand, all the other nations in that part of the world, South Korea. All of us have to come together and understand that the region is best served by peace and by stability and by open dialogue. And open dialogue means disagreement. You can't have a dialogue unless you're having some disagreement. And I just hope that the disagreements that will come along in any relationship can be handled in a way that reflects diplomacy. In my 4 years as Secretary of State and in my previous assignment as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and National Security Advisor, had a number of problems with the Chinese, but we were always able to work our way through it. The most prominent of these is the famous incident that occurred in April of 2001, where our two planes collided. And a number of people here in the United States were saying, oh, we now have a crisis with China. And I said, no, we've had an accident. Let's not let this incident become a crisis. And within about 2 weeks, my Chinese colleagues and I, and the leadership in the White House and the leadership in Beijing were able to come up with a solution that calmed things down. And frankly, because we were able to solve it without any crisis, it created a new friendship between the United States and China as to how we should deal with things like this. And my foreign minister colleague at that time, Foreign Minister Tang, and I, we understood one another better. And the first time I saw him after that incident, I said to him, you know, in the future when something like this happens, we should talk to each other immediately so we don't let things get out of control. So here's my home phone number. You can call me anytime, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. If you want to go through the State Department, fine, but you don't have to. Just dial me direct, and I will be there for you.
Did then Foreign Minister Tang call you?
We've talked that way, yes. He used to call me on my cell phone. Yeah, we once had a long conversation when I was in Israel, driving through the mountains, and he wanted to talk to me about something, and took it right away. But I always wanted to have that kind of relationship with Foreign Minister Tang, with Foreign Minister Lee, with my other colleagues there, with your current Foreign Minister. I know them all rather well, and I feel that I have been able to demonstrate to them the goodwill of the American people, but also the concerns of the American people. That's what a mature relationship is. When you're honest about your concerns and say, look, this is bothering us. And we also understand that we have different systems, different political systems. We're going to tell you about ours, you tell us about yours. We have some questions about your human rights activity, about suppression of freedom of expression. And so let's discuss these issues. We are not in a position to change your system. It works for you. Ours works for us. So let's find areas of cooperation, and when areas of conflict arise, then let's use our best diplomatic efforts to solve those problems.
That's behind the scenes to understand the 2001 collision better. With regard to rebalance to Asia, or pivot to Asia policy initiated by President Obama in 2011, how should China understand that? To what extent do you think that is a China containment policy?
I never use the word containment because you can't contain China, nor should we think we can contain China. I never would have used the term pivot. I think it was a bad choice of words. Why? Because you're pivoting towards something, and you're pivoting away from somebody, And so it was a term that seemed to annoy both the Chinese, who thought we were now coming after them in a containment strategy, and it annoyed our friends in Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere because it gave the impression we were turning away. America can't turn away from anywhere. We are represented throughout the world. We have interests throughout the world. And I've never used the term containment with respect to China. I think it's a lot better to use different kinds of language, such as, let's discuss a problem. Why are you doing this? Why don't you tell us more about your military activity? You know everything we do. You can read it in the newspaper. Let's get along as two mature countries that have interests.
I want to move on to the economic sphere. There's a slowdown of Chinese economy, and the market volatility is much talked about here. How concerned are you about the Chinese slowdown and its potential impact on the U.S. economy?
Well, it's having an impact on the world's economy, but the world's economy is having an impact on the Chinese economy. It's all interconnected. And so, as like any other official, I'm concerned about that. I think China understands the problem it has. It's been sailing along at wonderful growth rates for decades, 8, 9, 10%. And then suddenly things have started to change, and they have come to realize that some changes are going to be needed in their economic policy, the fiscal policy and monetary policy. I'm not an economist, but the one thing I do know, and I've been watching it for years now, is that China has to encourage its own people to be more consumer-like, like the rest of us. And I'll never forget, several years ago, I was visiting a Chinese think tank. And I was asking, what is the strategy for the future? And the answer was very, very simple. 4 parts. 1, we have to continue getting investment from the West, especially the United States. 2, we have to keep selling things to the West, especially the United States. 3, we have to start consuming more here in China and not always expect to have an economy that's going to be export supported alone. And we have the largest consumer market in the world. So let's start using that. And the 4th one I've never forgotten was he said, and remember, we have been very successful over the last 40 years in bringing 400 million people up out of poverty. And I consider that an absolutely great achievement on the part of China to have done this. And we can see it in all the cities and all the other fascinating things that have been done. But remember, General Powell, we still have 800 million people who are waiting their turn. And they need to have the same kinds of opportunities as the 400 million who are doing well. And so our focus has to be on rebuilding our infrastructure, going into the interior, creating new factories and plants,